So here is the trout survey data I have for Dunn County. These I have not don't know anything about these streams because I've never trout fished. I don't even think I fished before in Dunn County, Wisconsin. These streams are a little have a lot more brook trout than streams in the southern part of the driftless area. I think it might be partially due to geology or cold in the area and better base flow to streams. And I think the alkalinity of the water is lower, which seems to not have where brown trout don't seem to do as well, but brook trout seem to do better in the softer water streams. I think some of this county is actually glacial till and outwash, and some of this county is in the driftless and not glaciated. I know loess is deposited over some of it too. So, and anyways, these surveys were done by electrofishing, either backpack electrofishing or like an electrofishing boat they walk up and down the stream with. And they sample a certain distance of the stream, and you have someone net all the fish that come up over a certain distance of the stream, and then you place them into a tub of water which keeps them alive, and then you weigh them and measure them and record the amount of each species and release them back into the stream to do this type of samples. And how I categorize them is the number of brook trout per mile, the number of brown trout per mile, the number of brook trout over 10 inches per mile, and the number of brown trout over 12 inches and 16 inches per mile, and the largest brook trout and brown trout they catch in the survey. And if one of the species is not listed on the survey, it's because they didn't catch any brook trout or any brown trout in a given creek if there's not one of the species listed. And based on, you measure the distance that you electrofish, then you use that to calculate the amount of fish per trout per mile, which is what they use to categorize trout abundance in these streams, or fish per meter if you're in metric. So the first stream is South Fork Hay Creek. This creek has brook trout in it. It has a high amount of brook trout compared to the previous surveys I've been posting in my other videos. Like I previously said at the start of this video, there's more brook trout in this county than in the previous videos I posted. The only other county I posted where there's a lot of brook trout in the surveys was Monroe County. And this stream has some decent sized brook trout. I don't know what this creek looks like, but if you want to catch brook trout, this would definitely be a place worth trying. The next stream is Sandy Creek. I assume there must be sand by this creek, but I could be wrong. This stream has a good population of brook trout, but not any large brook trout. The next creek is Sand Creek. This stream was surprising to me because it had a lot of really large brown trout in it. I have no idea what this creek looks like, but it has a high abundance of brown trout, especially for this county, and it has a really high abundance of large brown trout compared across to streams across the whole driftless area. I hope I'm not, now everyone's probably going to be fishing there of the 40 people that watch this video. Although not a lot of them are probably going to live in the driftless area. But the previous videos I posted like this have only gotten like 40 views, so hopefully not too many people see this. The next creek is Pine Creek. This creek has some brook trout in it, some decent sized brook trout, and I think one or two brown trout were caught in the one survey. I don't know how large this creek is. I assume this creek is pretty small, but I could be wrong. The next stream is Little Otter Creek. This creek has a few brook trout, and I'm assuming this is a little tiny creek. That's probably why it's called Little Otter Creek. So it must flow into a bigger Otter Creek or Otter Creek. The next creek is Little Beaver Creek. This must be a little small creek that flows into Beaver Creek too. This just has a few brook trout in it. If I remember right, looking at all the trout streams for this map, there's a whole bunch of like little something creeks. So there's a whole bunch of tiny creeks that are tributaries or like North Fork or South Forks that are included in this. So a lot of these creeks are connected to each other. You just need to go through the ambition of looking at a map to see which ones flow into which ones. The next creek is Johns Creek. This stream has a good population of brook trout, although none of the brook trout are very large. So if you like to catch some 7 or 8 inch brookies, this might be a good creek to go to. The next creek is Hay Creek. This creek has brook trout in it. I shouldn't even include the brown trout numbers on it because I think I thought when I previously this they caught some brown trout, but they didn't catch any brown trout out of this creek. This has a reasonable population of brook trout in it, and a few all right size ones. So this might be a creek you want to try it if you want to catch some brookies. The next creek is 18 Miles Creek, and I wonder how many miles long this creek is. I would guess it would be 18 miles, but I could be wrong. This stream has a good population of brook trout in it and a few brown trout in it. And I assume the upper part of the creek is more brook trout than the lower part of the creek, but I really have no idea where these surveys are. But if you want to catch some brook trout, this would be a stream worth trying. And some of the brook trout are actually all right sized. The next creek is Crosby Creek. I'm assuming this is a tiny headwater creek, and this just has a few brook trout in it. The next creek is Coon Creek. I wonder if there's any raccoons that live by this creek. I guess you could think about that by the name. I'm assuming there are. The coons probably eat a lot of the larger trout, so there's only small trout in this creek. And they only caught trout. The next creek is Cranberry Creek. So if you want to eat some cranberries, this might be the creek where you would want to try fishing. This stream just has a few brook trout in it, but the brook trout they caught in it were large. It must flow under I-94 because I-94 is listed as one of the locations on it, but I don't know how good of a creek this is. This might be a larger creek, and there just might be a few straggler larger brookies in it, but I could be wrong. The next creek is Bowling Creek. This stream has a lot of brook trout in it, some decent sized brook trout. On these surveys, there's so few brook trout over like 12 or 14 inches that are caught in these creeks. So like a 13 or 14 inch brook trout I'm counting is a big fish. That's actually the biggest brookie I think I've caught out of the driftless was like 15. So that probably is a big fish because I've caught thousands of brook trout. So this creek would be a good creek to try for brook trout. I don't know how much public or private is on it, but there's definitely lots of brook trout in it. The next creek is Big Elk Creek. I bet you there's a 6x6 just walking along this creek when you go fishing there. This creek has both brown and about equal amounts of brown and brook trout, although none of the fish are very large. I must need to go back and look at the survey because I don't even have the brown trout max link. So I'll double check that before I export this. The next creek is Big Beaver Creek. There's probably a bunch of big beaver dams on this creek, so I'd be really careful walking in this creek with your waders. You might get some beaver sticks that go through your waders. This stream has some brook trout in it, a few decent sized brook trout, but nothing special. But I'm sure it's a good stream to trap along. The next creek is Annis Creek. This creek has some brook trout in it, some all right sized brook trout, but not a lot of brook trout. The next creek is Beaver Creek. I'd watch out for beaver dams on this creek too. This stream has quite a few brook trout in it. And a secret to fishing is a lot of times behind the beaver dams, a bunch of trout will sometimes school up behind the beaver dams and it'll create a big pool. But one cautionary thing about beaver dams is too many beaver dams might cause the water to warm up and may decrease the population of brook trout, but the beavers will do fine. So this might be a good stream to trap along or hunt for beavers along. The next creek is Elk Creek. I'm really curious how many elk are walking around there. There's probably only a couple, but This creek has quite a few brown trout in it. I have heard of this, or maybe I've just seen it from reading the regulations. This has quite a few decent sized brown trout in it. So if you're wanting to target browns in this county, this would probably be a stream to go to. And it has a few brook trout. The next creek is Vance Creek. This stream has a decent amount of brook trout in it, but no big ones. The next stream is Tiffany Creek. This creek also has a good population or decent population of brook trout. I guess one survey had caught a lot of brook trout, but the other surveys didn't catch many brook trout. And those were all the same location too. These surveys can really vary highly at the same location depending upon year. I'm assuming with my code that's probably County Highway Q. I just gave random codes to some of these that if you were smart you could figure them out. But like one year they'll catch like 1,000 trout at the location, and the next year they'll only catch like 100 and something. Because I think a lot of times they do these surveys during the summer, and if it's been really hot out for a period of time, certain stretches of the creek will get too warm and trout won't be in that stretch. Or vice versa too. If it's colder out, sometimes the lower stretches will have more fish in them because there's generally more as the streams are. As the stream water gets higher and the water gets warmer, there's generally more fish species and more diversity or more insect species that live in there, and there's more food. But then the issue for trout is the streams get too warm in the summertime. So like the bigger fish a lot of times will swim down to the lower parts of the streams to eat food, but then when the water gets cold, they all swim up into the little headwater streams. But the fish like to have deeper water to hide in too. The next creek is Washburn Farm Creek. This stream just has a few brook trout in it. The next stream is Clack Creek. This stream has a reasonable population of brook trout in it. Nothing large though. Next stream I have is Flayton Creek. This stream has quite a few brook trout in it, but none of the brook trout are very large. The next creek I have is Gilbert Creek. This stream has a good population of trout in it. It has some brook and some brown trout in it. There's a few decent sized trout of both caught too. So this would be a good stream to try to catch some fish. As you can see with this too, at the same location, the amount of fish really varies depending upon year. But I don't know what this creek is like, so I don't know what it's like to fish. And I'm just a doctor of soil, so I would not take my trust on fish. The next creek is Knight's Creek. I bet you there's some knights standing in armor there, so you probably should be careful if you go there. And this creek has both brook trout and brown trout, but more brook trout than brown trout. There's some all right sized brook trout caught there though, and a few all right sized brown trout. The next creek is Middle Branch Gilbert Creek. This creek has a lot of brook trout in it, but they're small. But I assume this is a tiny headwater stream because it's the middle branch, so it's not the main creek. The next creek is North Branch Gilbert Creek. This creek has a lot of brook trout in it. And it has some decent sized brook trout, and it probably stays really cold and has some cover for them to hide in. So this would be a good spot to go if you want to catch brook trout. The next creek is Otter Creek, and it doesn't look like otters have ate all the brook trout out of this creek, but they probably ate all the brown trout out of this creek. Actually, I don't even know if the brown trout are stocked in this creek or anything it flows into because I don't know these creeks very well. And I'm just making stupid jokes on this video, but this stream has an okay amount of brook trout, the ones that got away from the otters, and it has some brook trout that are over 10 inches. The next creek is Popple Creek. I'm assuming it flows through a popple thicket, so be careful you don't get lost in the popple thicket. And this creek just has some brook trout in it, but not very many brook trout. The next creek is Wilson Creek. This creek has a lot of surveys on it. This creek has a lot of trout, mostly brook trout, some brown trout. So this would probably be a good creek to try to fish too, although there's not a lot of large fish. There's some larger fish, but definitely a spot that might be worthwhile trying. The next creek is Rush Creek. I don't know how many rushes are growing along this creek, but or if it's just rushing down a hill very fast and very steep. That could be why it's called Rush Creek too, because of rushing water. But this creek has some brook trout in it. Next creek is Torgerson Creek. This stream just has brook trout in it, as many of these previous creeks. There's no large brook trout in this creek though. This must be Torgerson Creek continued, and that also just has brook trout. Next creek is North Branch Wilson Creek, and this creek has a lot of brook trout in it. Some of them are all right sized. The next creek is West Branch Knights Creek. Is this like the west facing arm of the Knight or something? But this creek has some brook trout in it, but they're really small. Next creek is Quarter Creek, and Quarter Creek has some brook trout in it that are small. It's probably a tiny headwater creek. The next creek is Rock Creek, and I bet the whole bottom of it is clay, and it has only a couple brook trout, and it's the only thing they caught one brook trout in the survey. I don't even know why I included it. And next creek is West Branch Knights Creek. Did I post this one twice? I must have been half asleep when I did this. That creek has a lot of brook trout. And here's the source where I got these surveys from.